Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's talk. My name is Jacques Lamarre. I'm the Special Programs Coordinator for the Mark Twain House and Museum, and I'm also your host for this evening, moderating our conversation on behalf of the museum. Tonight, we are welcoming two very special people. We are welcoming B.J. Hollars, who is an author based in Wisconsin, and his son, Henry, for a discussion of their new book, Go West, Young Man, a father and son rediscover America on the Oregon Trail. I'll introduce our two lovely guests more formally in just a moment, but first I want to thank our sponsors for tonight's event. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away last year. And we're happy to honor his memory with these programs, which we know he would have loved. We're also grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all our other virtual programs. And of course, we always thank the Greater Hartford Arts Council. One of the benefits of this being a virtual program is that you, as the audience, can have your own conversation in the chat alongside our guest discussion tonight, and we encourage you to do so. Like I see Judy has chimed in about her experience on the Oregon Trail. So feel free to jump in and be part of the conversation that way. You will notice in the upper right-hand corner of that chat, a link where you will be able to purchase your own signed copy of Go West, Young Man. We'll have to ask BJ and Henry if Henry signed them as well. But at a very minimum, you'll be getting an autographed copy signed by B.J. Hollars, who is a wonderful author. If you have a specific question, we ask that you not put it in the chat field, but in the Ask a Question feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. So at the end of the program, we're going to have a question and answer where BJ, Henry, and myself will answer questions that you may have. So please be sure to put that in the Ask a Question feature so it doesn't get lost in the chat. While we're on the topic of things that you can click on at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a very long green bar. That is where you can click to make a donation to the Mark Twain House Museum. And at the moment, your donation will be supersized. You will get an additional 15% added to your generosity. That will be covered by the Birdies for Charity campaign by Webster Bank. And so if you give $10, we get an extra $1.50. If you give $100, we get an extra $15. That's as much math as you're going to get out of me tonight. But you can either choose to support us through buying the book, or you can click on that green bar. Either way, your money gets put to very good use at the Mark Twain House. So now that I've said all that, I want to introduce our guests who I'm particularly excited about tonight. B.J. Hollars is the author of several books, most recently Go West, Young Man. His work has been featured in the Washington Post, Parents Magazine, NPR, and elsewhere. He is the recipient of the Truman Capote Prize for Literary Nonfiction, the Ann B. and James B. McMillan Prize, the Council of Wisconsin Writers Bly Derleth Award. I'm going to get him for this, among others. He is an associate professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. And Henry Hollars is the illustrator of Go West, Young Man, a Father and Son Rediscover America on the Oregon Trail. His work has been featured on the Family Refrigerator and elsewhere. He is the family record holder for highest jump on the backyard trampoline, and additionally, he has endured a 2,500-mile road trip with his very gassy father. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to BJ and Henry as we bring them up on the screen. And I'm going to ask everyone who's watching to sit back and enjoy. And don't forget, if you have a question, please pop it in the Ask a Question feature.
Well, thank you so much, Jacques. Very gassy father. I don't think that was part of the original bio, but I really like the addition.
Yes, it was.
Well, it's true to form.
Okay.
You know me well. You know me well.
All right. Things are happening on the screen. I'm going to explain why very quickly before I go away and turn this over. Normally, we have a 40-minute or so conversation between the author and, in this case, illustrator and our moderator. However, as you can imagine, these two, having taken their show on the road, have a little bit of a dog and pony show that they want to share with us that will include slides from their travels and readings from the book. So I'm going to turn this over to BJ and Henry, and we will be back in 20 minutes, or I will be back in 20 minutes to enjoy a conversation with them. Take it away, guys.
Thank you. And thank you, Jacques. And thank you, Alice, behind the scenes helping with the tech. And hello, everyone. And welcome to BJ and Henry's
Henry and BJ's
Reading and Conversation from our new book, Go West, Young Man, A Father and Son.
A Son and Father.
Rediscover America on the Oregon Trail. Now, the 2 weeks recounted in this book were the best 2 weeks of our lives.
His life.
And that concludes most of our pre-planned shtick. But on a far more serious note, we want to acknowledge that here in Wisconsin, we are on the sacred and ancestral lands of the Ojibwe and Dakota people. Prior to our journey along the Oregon Trail, we might have overlooked such important information, but now we know better. And being mindful of our past and our place within it was but one of the many lessons we learned throughout our 2,500-mile road trip from Eau Claire, Wisconsin to Oregon's Willamette Valley. Now, for those of you whose knowledge of the Oregon Trail doesn't extend much beyond that oh-so-famous computer game in which we all shot more meat than we could carry, forded the river when we should have taken the ferry, and eventually died of
dysentery.
Allow me to give you the very abridged version of the real history. You see, from 1846 to 1869, the Oregon imported some 400,000 immigrants to the West Coast. Some traveled for gold and God, others for farmland beyond the Rockies. Most immigrants were middle class, not so rich that they were satisfied with what they had, but not so poor that they couldn't afford to outfit a wagon for the journey ahead. Over 25 years, some 65,000 immigrants died along the way. That's the entire population of our city of Eau Claire, which is why today the Oregon Trail is known as the world's longest graveyard. By some estimates, a body was buried on average every 80 yards along the way. So that's the history, or at least a very small part of it. But what Henry and I will talk about tonight is the contemporary story, our story, what we discovered about ourselves and our country while retracing the trail 150 years later. So to begin, why, Henry, following the final bell on the last day of kindergarten, did we decide to embark upon this journey to retrace the Oregon Trail?
Well, because you made me.
Because I made him. And one day he's going to thank me. As for why I struck out on the trail, it felt like my last chance to steer us clear of the trappings of 21st century technology. For too long, I found myself clicking and swiping and scrolling my way through my days and losing cherished minutes with my son. I wanted to take us to a place where we couldn't even get cell phone reception if we tried. And on occasion, we actually found those places. But the other reason was because I hoped to, quote, rediscover America and Americans along the way. I need not remind you that 2018 was a pretty contentious moment in America, as was 2016, as was 2020. While a part of me hoped to reaffirm my convictions for what I believe to be the promise of America, another part strove to do the harder thing, unsaddle my high horse, stand down from my soapbox, and allow a difference in opinion to serve as the opening salvo to a conversation rather than the final word. Easier said than done, but easier done too in the presence of a child. When Mark Twain headed west in 1861, he was wise enough not to take a child. He famously said, "All you need in this life is ignorance and confidence, and then success is sure." Well, Henry and I possessed nothing if not ignorance and confidence, so we figured it'd be more or less smooth sailing for us. But it was actually a different American author who inspired our trip. In the fall of 1960, John Steinbeck drove his camper truck cross-country to answer a question quite similar to the one I'd posed. What are Americans like today? Fully aware of his daunting charge, Steinbeck solicited the help of an unlikely sidekick.
A French poodle named Charlie.
A French poodle named Charlie. Quote, "In establishing contact with strange people, Charlie is my ambassador," Steinbeck wrote. "I release him and he drifts toward the objective, or rather, to whatever the objective may be preparing for dinner. By breaking down social barriers, Charlie more than earned his keep. A child can do the same thing," Steinbeck added, "but a dog is better." Maybe in most cases, but John Steinbeck never met Henry Hollars, who was our secret weapon in diffusing tense situations. People, thankfully, still think twice before being a total jerk in front of a child. And so begins the family photo portion of the evening. Here we are in Alcove Springs, Kansas, the site of where the Donner Party Reed slept and where they saw their first casualty, a 70-year-old named Sarah Keyes, whose body is still buried somewhere in an undisclosed grave right beyond this photo here. And here Henry is at Chimney Rock, where his hair is doing a pretty spot-on impression of the rock itself. You can't make this stuff up. Chimney Rock, of course, is the most recognizable geological feature along the trail, and the rock that allowed immigrants to kind of breathe a big sigh of relief, confirmation that they were headed in the right direction. Here he is at the top of Independence Rock. The whole trip we had talked about climbing to the top of Independence Rock. And then we got there and we realized it really isn't much of a path to get to the top, but we made a path and nobody caught us. So it was one of the prouder moments for us. Here we are at Scotts Bluff, another very well-known landmark along the trail. And this is one of my favorite photos from the whole trip. Here Henry is in the wagon ruts in Guernsey, Wyoming. So just try to imagine the tens of thousands of wagons that literally carved this pathway through the rock over the course of those 15 or so years. Just incredible. It's nearly as tall as Henry is at this point. And finally, we got these guys who are getting a little goofy by trip's end. I kind of love those guys, but because we can't be those guys again, you'll have to settle for these guys you have with you tonight. So sit back, relax, and join these guys for 2 scenes from the greatest 2 weeks of our lives.
His life. One
day he's going to thank me. And I should note, too, that usually in our shtick, we do 3 scenes. The first one kind of opens things up. You get to know us a little bit. But for time purposes tonight, we're going to cut that one and go straight to the pure madness. So this is us in one of our more heated moments. So buckle up. This takes place about midway through the trip in the deserts of Idaho. After concluding a brief stop at Register Rock, Henry and I hop back into the car in preparation for the final 200-mile leg to Boise. Yet upon starting the engine, I notice an unfamiliar message scrolling along the Jeep's display screen. Huh. Well, that's weird.
What's weird?
The screen says oil change recommended.
What's that mean?
Well, if forced to wager a guess, outside the brown desert sizzles at a sweat-inducing 91 degrees, though inside the vehicle, the temperature gauge climbs even higher.
What do we do?
We just sit tight, nothing to worry about. Yet, cut to my nightmare. A red-headed vulture soaring over our vehicle, followed by Henry and me dragging our dehydrated bodies through the rattlesnake-infested desert, gasping for water as the sun sinks over the cacti. In an attempt to avoid such a fate, I put the car in drive, merging into traffic while Henry glances the mighty Snake River off to my left. The mere sight of it reminds Henry that he's thirsty.
Dad, can I drink from this water bottle?
Sure, just screw the cap back on when you're done.
No problem. Dad?
Yeah?
I can't get the cap on.
What do you mean you can't get the cap on?
I mean, it won't go on.
Just calm down. Everything's going to be, at that moment, a new message scrolls across the Jeep's display screen. Oil change required. Henry, I need you just to figure it out for yourself.
But Dad...
Look, I'm going 80 miles an hour here, and apparently we require an oil change. So I need you to do the one thing I can't do for you right now. I need you to screw on the cap.
But I tried.
Henry, you are 6 years old. You're a kindergarten graduate. I know you can do it. Henry gives it another try, though when he catches me glowering in the rear view, any last vestige of water bottle cap twisting confidence immediately vanishes. What follows are the longest 2 minutes of our lives. It's not like you're cracking a safe, Henry.
It won't go on.
It's all about the threading. Just match the threading on the cap to the threading on the bottle.
That's what I am doing.
Henry, you survived the storm, remember? And you climbed to the top of Independence Rock. You swam in a hot spring. You explored a cave. You can do it. Just turn it to the left.
I am.
Hindsight, I probably should have just screwed on the cap. How easy it would have been to pull to the side of the road, guide him through the careful art of water bottle cap screwing, and then continue on our way. Instead, I take another approach, screaming at the top of my lungs. Henry, someday Daddy's not going to be here to do it for you. Don't you understand? I'm trying to make you self-sufficient. I'm trying to prepare you for this unforgiving, God-forsaken world.
Wait, when are you not going to be here for me?
Rather than engage in a candid discussion on the average human lifespan, I begin a glorious backpedaling. Like when you go off to college or whatever.
Oh, I thought you were dying.
Let's just focus on the cap for now. All you have to do is turn it to the left. Please, just show me you can do it. Summoning a bit of magic we could have used 5 minutes ago. At last, the threads align.
I did it.
Darn right you did.
The problem was you told me to turn to the left, but I actually had to turn to the right.
I realize he may be onto something. But rather than fess up and lose credibility forever, I do the fatherly thing and lie like a rug. I meant my right, which is actually your left.
Man, that doesn't make any sense.
He convulses with laughter. All right, how about this? I was teaching you a valuable lesson.
Don't drink water?
No. Never, under any circumstances, listen to your father. In the time it takes most people to screw on a water bottle cap, our lowest moment becomes our highest. Henry cackles at my stupidity. Since it beats crying, we laugh until the road runs out. We leave the dust behind, the ghosts behind, and make this mile a memory too. So the presentation tonight is called Make Every Mile a Memory. I wish I could say I came up with that lovely phrase, but in fact, I saw it on the back of a bumper sticker on a dump truck shortly after we'd rented our rental vehicle. We were driving back home, ready to hit the road later that day, and I just stopped at the stop sign, saw that bumper sticker, and it became the mantra that got us through some of those more difficult miles for sure. So we're going to close now with one more, even briefer scene from our final destination, the Oregon coast's Nehalem Bay State Park. So after nearly 2 weeks on the dusty road, we're more than a little ready for the ocean. And so this scene picks up on our final night prior to saying farewell to our trip. On our final afternoon, we go for one last walk along the shores of the Pacific. Well, bud, I say as the sun sinks low, I think it's time we head back.
You mean home?
Well, soon, but for now, I just mean back to the tent.
Oh, for a minute I thought you meant home, but I do want to go home.
Me too. Though we'd never have admitted it earlier, by our second to last day, home is the only destination we desire. After all these days and all these miles, at last we have run out of things to talk about. No more lessons to tender or receive, no more adventures to embark upon. Overhead, I hear a squall, and upon lifting my gaze, I lay eyes upon the most cliché creature this moment could possibly have conjured. Here, at the end of our journey to rediscover America, we see a bald eagle, soaring, majestically no less. Are you kidding me? I shout toward the sky. Surely this bird has been pulled from central casting, a near-perfect end to a near-perfect trip. I shake my head at the wonder of it all. How in moments like this, the world is simply too much. As the eagle concludes its air show and fades into the horizon, Henry turns to me.
Dad?
Yeah?
I think...
You think what?
I think...
Buddy, it's okay. You can tell me. This is the moment I've been waiting for. Not some eagle soaring, manufactured, made-for-TV moment, but the one in which my unconditional love for my son is made clear to him and his is made clear to me. This is the moment that will forever bind us to some unknown plane, one half as high as heaven and twice as deep as the Platte River. Henry looks at me, drawing upon his wellspring of strength.
Well, I just think...
Yes, my son, what is it?
I think I'm finally sick of it.
I smile, sigh, slap an arm around his not-so-small shoulder. You know, bud, I think I'm finally sick of you too. And what better place to end than the most honest moment of all? We will shut this part down and let Jacques come on board and take it away. What questions do you got for us?
All right, we're back. Thank you for sharing that. It was like theater. I'm a playwright by trade, and I was like, oh, they're acting.
That's a very, very fine word you're using for what you just saw occurring there.
Yes,
but thank you.
Yes. No, Daniel, he's not just going to read from his book. If we can have you two scooch in a little bit closer. I know, Henry, you're probably working on something madly important, but now your dad said it was a near perfect trip. Do you agree?
I guess. I don't know.
No.
Sure?
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, I think one of the things that's really fascinating about this book, and it wasn't something that necessarily would spring out from listening to the two excerpts that you read, is that there's a lot going on in this book aside from just a father-son road trip. There is a lot of history that you learn about westward expansion and the Oregon Trail. And then there's also a lot going on about Native American history and the sacrifices that the Native American population made, not willingly, to make manifest destiny happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of want to talk about how, going into the trip, and this is more for BJ than for you at the moment, Henry. What was your thought as you were starting out on this trip? What did you think, or, what did you think what was the mission?
Yeah, exactly. And, it's when we do these readings, we find that they go over a little better when we can kind of play up the more father-son parts, because that's kind of the entertainment value of it. But the reason we do the entertainment value is to get us to the history. And so I'm really glad you asked that question. When I'm writing the book, it's always trying to balance, like, give the people the Cheetos, what they want, the less than good for you food, which is kind of what you're seeing here. And then hopefully give them the stuff that's the vegetables, a little more important, the stuff that's going to maybe do good for our bodies. And that's where the history comes in.
Daniel's been waiting for the vegetables.
Well, we got some vegetables for you, Daniel. Don't you worry. Hang tight. And the truth is, I think going into this, I knew the broad strokes of the story. I certainly grew up playing that computer game, and we actually interviewed the creator of that game. And so, the broad strokes, kind of indigenous people were exploited in many ways, but we didn't know the details of those stories, And if you watch Hollywood films, you would think it's this constant, like, cowboy and Indian shootout, which was also not the case. Some 400 people died at the hands of indigenous people, immigrants, and then vice versa. So it was more or less equal in terms of death count, which is one measurement, not certainly the best measurement at all. But this wasn't the widespread problem that I think Hollywood makes you believe. There was a lot of partnership along the way, but indeed there were moments when that partnership failed, primarily as a result of immigrants exploiting the lands of those people. So I think that was the big thing, was like figuring out how to get beyond the myth of manifest destiny to try to learn the truer story. And the best place to learn that for us was to go to a museum with a guy named John Beavis, who's an elder of the Umatilla tribe. And he spent a lot of time really kind of taking us through our paces and helping us understand our own privilege in new ways.
And Henry, what was your mission for this trip?
Ice cream?
Yes.
A lot of good food, a lot of tent camping.
To get as much food as possible.
Yeah. It was more of a culinary tour for him at the start. Yeah.
Got it. No. I was a bit shocked, to be honest, that you ordered a side salad at one point, Henry.
It was like, Dad was like, okay, you gotta get this salad. I'm like,
it's sort of the climactic moment of the book. Henry orders a side salad. No one's ever seen anything like it before. It was unbelievable.
No. Well, the way your dad wrote it, he made it sound completely voluntary and unprovoked. So you should talk to your attorney.
Actually, now that I think about it, he's probably right. I do like the salads from some places, just not all places.
They did give him a free dessert because he ordered a salad, so I think it was all a wash in the end. So
there you go. Mm-hmm. So, BJ, back to you.
Yeah.
Obviously, you were going out west. For us here in Connecticut, everything from New York on is out west. But you were going at we're still in it, a particularly fractious moment in American history.
Yeah.
And what did you anticipate and what did you find in terms of, because one of the things that you say is that you're going to rediscover America, and that's history, that's, white person's history, Native American history, but also modern American society. So let's hear about what you thought you might encounter and how did it surprise you?
That's a really, really insightful question. It's complicated, you know. The truth is, along the way, and I talk about this in the book, all these really nice things kept happening to us, you know, and we needed that oil change. And this guy at Jiffy Lube hooked us up, refused to charge us, just wished us the best, sent me a postcard from the road. A woman at a bookstore just loved our story so much, she gave Henry just straight up money to buy a souvenir. There were just all these like red carpet treatment things. And then I was in Portland one night, and a friend of mine said, well, that's really great, but how might your trip be different if you weren't a straight white guy with a 6-year-old? And I was like, well, yeah, you know, here we are talking about privilege and exploitation, all of these things from the past, but we hadn't fully reasoned out what that meant for us today. And so when we were on the road, yes, a lot of very nice interactions, but also some not so great ones, not necessarily directed at us, but there was one that we were just talking about last night that occurred at a fast food restaurant on Father's Day morning. Out by the river in Oregon City or Baker City, one of those. And there's this white guy in this big old pickup truck, revving his engine, getting anxious, wanting his food. And this person who was not white, I'm not quite sure what his background was, came running out to give the food to this guy in the truck. And this guy just lost it, just cussing and shouting and screeching off. And Henry and I were just shocked. You know, we hadn't seen anything quite this dramatic. And so I ran over to the guy and I was just like, hey, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And he just went, oh, that happens all the time. Didn't even faze him. And the fact that that happens all the time really, really struck us in a way that I think some of the historical moments didn't quite seem as real to us because it's history. You know, we didn't see it with our own eyes. But when we started seeing those things with our own eyes, it really woke us up in new ways.
Yeah, I find, and for people who have not read the book, and again, we encourage you to please click the link to purchase the book. It is going to help pay for Henry to go to college and for therapy to get over this trip.
Maybe buy 2 copies. Yeah.
That the book is not political. It's not a situation of, you know, we were surprised to find that liberals were nice or that conservatives were nice or what have you like that. It's but I do feel like one of the things, because I'm currently listening to the audiobook for the 1619 Project, which is obviously a very controversial work with a number of people, but it's looking at American history through a different lens, through, you know, not necessarily the white lens in the history that oftentimes we're taught. Do you have a feeling as you were going through this that you were unlearning what you knew about the Oregon Trail and about westward expansion and our relationship with Native Americans?
Very much so for me. And I'm not sure what they were teaching you in school when he was in kindergarten at the time. So I think this was his first real look at it, and he got some after the fact as well. But yeah, I mean, when I was going to school, it was that rah, rah, here come the wagons, you know, and then we did it and we conquered and it's ours magically, you know, and manifest destiny as a policy is so duplicitous, you know, and this idea that it's endowed to us from God. I mean, God is not a real estate agent, as far as I know. I don't think God would encourage people to exploit so many people along the way. That would lead to so many deaths along the way and the destruction of culture on top of all of that. And so it really was it's a dark story, you know, but I think it's far worse if we try to not address it. You know, so far the only criticism I've gotten from the book was, you're too mean to white people. And frankly, I was a lot more concerned of being too nice to the immigrant story and not fair or even-handed to the story of Indigenous people, which is the one we don't hear nearly enough. There's only one museum throughout the entire country where it focuses on the Indigenous perspective of what happened. And that's where we met John Beavis, and that's where he began to tell us more about that story. And so even when we've done some readings, there have been some kind of demographics of people who question kind of our take on history, but it's all very much factual. It's just that when you look at a history book, it's usually 90% of kind of what the immigrants did and maybe 10% mention of the Indigenous experience. And so we wanted to try to do our best to create a little more balance to that, even though we are not the ideal purveyors of the message. We just wanted to at least try to amplify the scholars, primarily Indigenous scholars who've done that work better than we have.
But I don't feel like you villainize the immigrants, you know. I feel like you have a lot of heart and respect for what they did and what they accomplished and the tragedies that many of them faced along the trail.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think we've got a lot of cruelty toward them either. I think some people took offense to, talking about, potential systemic racism and these sorts of things. And it kind of got caught up in a culture war with a person or two, but on the whole, I mean, there is much to admire about what the immigrants did. And I think they are, in fact, a product of their time. And so some of the transgressions that we know as transgressions today might not have seemed that way for some of them due to the biases of that era. You read some of the historical trail journals from that time, and you can certainly see some of those biases coming through. But also there's so many stories of working together and cross-cultural exchange. And these kind of moments are really of most interest to me.
Yeah. Henry, were you surprised that your father took you to a casino?
He didn't let me. He only let me go to the kids area, and he wasn't even going to let me stay there. He was like, how much is it? $5 an hour. Okay, let's go, Henry.
It was cheaper than the slot machines, though, so, we had to make a choice.
Gotcha. But you like the hot springs?
Yes. We're only there for like half an hour, though.
Boy.
Everyone's a critic.
How did you keep busy in the car for so many hours?
I wrote my dad a book for Father's Day, and that took most of the time. And I played with my Toy Story figures that I had.
Uh-huh. Now, I understand that you used, I don't know if these illustrations came from your book that you did for Father's Day, or if they were separate.
They were.
There are a few that I think need, now, so how did the illustration process work between father and son? Did he tell you I need a picture for this scene, or were these things that you did along the trip, or?
Yeah. Well, it was more like right at when we got back from the trip. Once in a while, he would be like, Henry, you have to draw a picture, and I was like, okay, which one?
He was really into it, the whole process, as you can tell.
Yeah, I was like.
All right, so I'm going to show a few pictures. I don't have them on PowerPoint, but I'm going to show a few pictures. I'm going to ask Henry to tell us what was going on in these particular moments, okay?
Okay.
So this one is the storm, and I know everyone's seeing this probably backwards. But Henry, tell us what's going on in this picture.
Well, in the storm, the tent part is only a tiny bit, like not truthful, because the tent was in the air, but just not that much.
Yeah, we forgot to stake down the tent on quite a dramatic storm on our first night of camping. We were soaked and drenched and running for cover. But yeah, we endured, and then the next night we got a hotel room because we were big babies. Yeah,
you're big babies. Okay. All right. Did I lose my spot here? Because there was one that I really wanted to ask you about. Chimney Rock. What's going on here?
So, BJ Hollars is falling off falling off Chimney Rock, and I'm successfully climbing to the top, and he's getting chased down, falling. Rattlesnakes falling right, like above him, trying to like get to him.
Got it.
And it's not even fully accurate. When I was falling off of Chimney Rock, it was simply one rattlesnake. So little exaggeration, but.
Okay. All right. We already heard about the water bottle incident, so I'm going to skip over that illustration. Why don't we talk about this one here?
Yeah, remember this one? Ian Kaiser of Fort Wayne?
Nope.
All right, well, I can talk about this one.
And also,
I think this is one of the interesting things about the book is about dwelling on mortality too.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about this book, that I mentioned earlier, the world's longest graveyard, a body every 80 feet along the way. We stopped. One of the most poignant moments, the whole book, yards, excuse me. One of the most poignant moments for me on the trip was when we stopped to visit the grave of a 6-year-old who died in 1843 or so, named Joel Hembry. And so Henry and I had to go deep on private lands with a guide, and he might be the only 6-year-old in history to pay his respects to this 6-year-old immigrant who died along the way. And I mean, the part of the tragedy of these deaths is, parents would bury their children, children would bury their parents, and then they would roll on within the hour. And that was it. They'd never go back. Sometimes they'd mark the grave, sometimes not. They buried it deep and rubbed the wagons over it so no one would know there's a grave there. It was just tragic in so many ways. And so the illustration you just shared, that was from when we were in Oregon at a museum, and I kept trying to find some connection to my family history. Do I have any connection with this story, And I didn't, but I did find, just by happenstance, a grave or the recreation of a grave of a woman from Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is our hometown, or my hometown. So it was really interesting to kind of track down her story and learn about the people who tried to save her and couldn't, and then tried to kind of preserve her story in a few lines of journal entry, which we found, well over 100 years later.
Now, you did a lot of research with reading trail diaries, correct?
Yeah.
So let's talk about your research that you did.
Sure.
It's quite heavily researched. It's not just like we got in the car and got the biggest ice creams ever, although you did, right, Henry?
Very much so. Yes.
Best part of the trip? Best part of the trip?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Big fan. Yeah. If you look off to our right, you can't quite see. We got our little images are right beyond the Van Gogh. That's our little photo collage of our trip. And what you don't see in that photo is all the let's not take it off the wall. Let's just hang out. Is all the research that went into this. I have a writer friend named John Hildebrand who's been at this travel writing thing for a lot longer than I have. And we were sidling up at a watering hole right before I left. And he looked me in the eye and he said, "When things start going wrong, that's where your book begins." And so it was interesting because I researched everything I knew, every stop I needed, every trail marker I wanted to hit, every person I wanted to interview. And of course, it all went awry. By day 2, we were off schedule. We'd missed stuff, but we'd also had these unbelievable moments of unexpected circumstances that kind of worked in our favor. I think the best example of this was we were going to visit the grave of a woman, and we were going there to visit the grave. And there's one other person at this grave, and we're talking to them. Rebecca Winters was her name. And I was like, "Well, what brought you guys here?" And he goes, "Oh, that was my great-great-great-great-grandma." So here were the only other people at this grave were the ancestors of this woman we were here to learn about. And it was just like, if we had hit one more stoplight, we might have missed them altogether. But just the world conspired to give us this one moment of connection. And there were lots of weird moments like that. And so I guess to talk about the research briefly, I read the trail journals. I interviewed probably 18 people on the way. I interviewed people in advance, after, looked for primary sources, secondary sources, but the book didn't come together until we were there on location, learning from the people who lived in these towns. Really, it's a story of people in towns and how they see their own history and kind of what that history looks like in terms of reality, I guess, in some ways.
So one of the things that pops up a lot, and it's not surprising that I'd want to ask about this, are museums.
Yes.
Museums feature quite heavily, and I can see that Henry almost fell asleep when I mentioned the word museum. Henry, how do you feel about museums after this trip?
1 second. Tired.
Tired. You went to a lot of museums, right?
Yes. I don't think he understood that he was taking a 6-year-old.
You're correct. Yeah.
It's like, okay, now we have 30 minutes to drive this hour-long thing, so we gotta go like 2,000 miles an hour here.
It's quite a pace we set. Yeah.
Got it. So, historic interpretation can really vary from museum to museum. Mm-hmm. How did you obviously went to an indigenous museum. And was it Idaho?
Oregon, Pendleton, Oregon. Yep.
But you went to a lot of Oregon Trail museums that were really probably interpreted much more, or forts that would have resupplied people along the way. Yep. How did you find in terms of the interpretation of the Oregon Trail at these museums? And I'm not looking for you to say anything horrible about another museum, but
and I don't have anything horrible to say at all. I mean, I think every museum kind of had its niche and fulfilled a certain mission. A lot of them, of course, were kind of geographically linked to that particular point along the trail. So Fort Kearney talks about Fort Kearney and how they resupplied there, and having the mail service there, and reshoeing horses there, and all these sorts of things. And you go a little further and you got Fort Laramie, and they've got more about treaties and indigenous people and immigrant relations and these sorts of things. one of our favorite museums, I think, because it was the most interactive, was in Montpelier, Idaho. That was a really fun day. We went to a truck stop first and met these wonderful.
It was just after.
It was after. Okay. Well, we went to a truck stop at some point that day and met a lot of great people and got some really candid responses about what it's like to live in Montpelier, Idaho. But we also went to this museum that had this really cool, like interactive, like we were in the back of a wagon. Remember this? And the lights were on, and like awesome. You could hear the voices from trail journals being read to you. And then the wagon suddenly stops and the lights come on and you go out the front of the wagon. You're in an entirely different part of the museum. And it was really like part ride, part historical interpretation. But I think it really hit the mark for a 6-year-old, that's for sure. And maybe his father.
Fun. It was like, felt like it was moving kind of.
Motion goes a long way in museums for us.
Now, I want to talk about something I know that Henry is going to be very interested in. Tell me about swales.
Remember swales? About a third of the book is Henry not enjoying talking about swales. Every historian we met wanted to show us every swale in a 300-mile radius, and there's just not a lot to see there. So,
all right, now I did not know the term swale. So why don't you tell me what a swale is?
You want to talk about it? Go for it.
It's pretty much just like they went through there one time. Bump.
It's like the slightest indentation on the earth. That's not a hill. We wouldn't want to call it a hill, but it's somehow proof that a wagon once went over this particular part of the land. And so it's not like the wagon ruts you saw in that photo. It's like the slightest incline and decline that you will never know unless someone points it out to you. And even then you might miss it. But I'm glad they exist. You know, the people with the right eyes see it, and it's meaningful to them, and we'll get there. We'll get there.
Got it. And so how present are they? Because you started your journey in, what was the name of the town?
Independence, Missouri was our real starting point.
Okay. Yep. I was confusing that with Independence Rock, which is not Independence.
A lot of independence, yeah.
And so there are a lot of swales there, correct?
Some there. Alcove Springs in Kansas, that's where we really got our full swale quota. And it had to do a lot with this wonderful guy named Dwayne Isles, who really took the time to hike us deep into the country, show us these swales, help us look for the grave of Sarah Keyes, who was part of the Donner Party, but who died earlier, probably to her benefit, knowing the rest of that story. But I guess that's a part of the story too. There's so many random strangers who were willing to take us out and show us things. And one guy took us out into a cave. One guy showed us a grave. Like everyone knows their small slice of the story.
Right.
Yeah,
it was the same guy.
Same guy. But yeah, anyway.
Well, why don't you tell us about the cave, Henry?
What happened there? Tell us about it.
So there were a bunch of cave drawings, but there was this one that I didn't get at all. So I asked about it, and it said this like it's in the book. There's a picture of the cave, and it has a writing of the one that I didn't understand.
Yep.
And I guess I was the first one to find that cave drawing. Like no one has ever.
Right, this isn't the drawing that you're talking about.
No.
This is the cave. But you saw a name in there, right?
Yeah, it was, and I had no idea, and so I was like, "What is this? What is this thing?" And they're like, "What? I didn't know this was here."
And the name,
no one did.
The name looks like Kingstrom. It's right there.
Yes.
So I kept looking for trail journals.
Henry's version of the cave painting.
Yes. It was so cool because we were so deep into private land. Again, special permission, one guide. It was one of the most nerve-wracking moments of the trip for me because we don't know this guy.
We don't know this guy. But, it's a suspicious
but we
truck.
just went in this truck and he took us deep into the country. And then to make things even more weird, it was like I swear you could hear like the rattlesnakes on all sides of us. And I just had this like nightmare of like we're 50 miles from the nearest hospital minimum. You hear rattlesnakes all around you. We're climbing uphill. I was so nervous for Henry. I was just like carrying him like over my shoulder like a football player or something. I don't know. Up this hill to this cave. And that was actually beautiful once we got there and we saw what few people get to see, which is these incredible red ochre stylized cave art from indigenous people from at least 200 years ago. It's pretty cool.
I see we got 9 questions, which is a lot, and we may get some more. So I'm going to jump to questions because we have about 15 minutes left to do that. I do want to mention. Because I know it's very hard in these conversations to talk about what a lovely writer BJ is. And I'm not saying that just because he's here and being nice. I think that he has this way of synthesizing all this disparate information into this narrative, but also making it extremely heartfelt. And so it's a book for anyone who's done road trips. It's a book for anyone who's either a father or a son or a parent, and also people who want to know more about our national history and the current national temperature, and don't want to necessarily leave feeling completely decimated about the state of our country.
Right.
So thank you for all of that.
Sure.
All right. So now I want to mention to folks here, if you like a particular question, you can upvote it by clicking on the little arrow, and that will move it up in my attention span. All right. So William asks, I'm interested in travel logistics, highways versus secondary roads. Oh no, the question just moved. Lodging and people met, etc. That's a lot of the book itself. But let's talk about travel logistics, highways versus secondary roads, and lodging, and how you work that all out.
Well, great question. And yeah, I'm glad we have a chance to talk about this. There were probably more highways than I would like. I mean, only because we had such a small time frame. We had 2 weeks. We were paying this on our own dime, and we did this trip. There was no publisher. No one promised us anything. We were just taking this trip, hoping for the best. And so there were more highways than I would have preferred, but there were also some back roads. And there were times like when we went to Farson's Mercantile for that big cone we referenced earlier, we went off to Beaten Trail. And those were some of the most beautiful moments, of course. In terms of lodging, we were a big fan of the KOA. I got the Campground of America's app. And let me tell you, I go a little wild on that thing. So we stayed and camped out in KOAs more or less everywhere, with the exception of Boise, Idaho. Near the end, we took a day or two to breathe in a hotel, get a nice hotel pool. It was awesome. But we had some great times. One of our favorite KOAs was in Douglas, Wyoming. Can't explain why. It's a big part in the book, and it's just really like trying. I describe it as a deathbed day, which is a little dark, but this idea of like, it was such a perfect day that on my final day, I'm going to be thinking about reading Wayside Stories with Henry in the tent at 9 p.m. or getting that free s'more right up the road for at the campsite, or just these little interact people next door to us, and there's something beautiful about a campsite because no one tent camps anymore. So it's pretty much just us and one or two other weirdos. And those weirdos were always our people. So we always had a chance to meet people by virtue of no one else was doing what we were doing. Everyone else was in an RV. And so those people who were with us on the ground without a lot of mats, they were the ones with the best stories, and we're always willing to talk.
Henry, do you like camping?
Yes.
Good. All right. You and I are not on the same page on this. All right.
But cabins are better, he just told us.
Okay. All right. I was going to say, I would know that my dad didn't like me if he took me camping for a week. Or worse, 2 weeks. All right. And next question. Is the Oregon Trail similar, and this comes up in the book, to trail taken by the Mormons moving west? And thank you, Judy, for that question.
Great question, Judy. And this is a part of the book as well. I discussed that in at least one of the chapters, as we visit a site, Martin's Cove, where there was a major tragedy. What's so interesting about the Mormon part of this story is that rather than, ox-drawn wagons and all of this, they used hand carts. They had men primarily pulling hand carts, and they were able to do it at an incredible speed, faster than any other way of travel, primarily because of the partnerships that were created by way of this this shared religion and this faith. And so with the exception of Martin's Cove, which was a dramatic failure because they left too late in the season and winter came quick, and it was really a tragedy. Hundreds of people died, I think. But other than that, they were the fastest and most efficient immigrants for the entire trail. So that is very much a part of this journey as well. And kind of an interesting and fascinating, I don't want to say side story because it's a central part of the story, but it's a reminder that it's not, the whole story isn't just, white guys in wagons with their oxen traveling west. There's a lot of different ways people got there for a lot of different reasons.
And so, but there was also not just the Oregon Trail and the Mormon Trail, there's also other trails.
There is the
merge in various places, correct?
Exactly right. The California Trail is another one that's not identical to Oregon Trail, but they're often kind of lumped together. OCTA is a famous organization, the Oregon California Trail Association. So those two kind of both have that westward trip. The Lewis and Clark Trail, of course, many have heard of. I always dreamed of doing that one as well. And then there's the Santa Fe Trail. And so what's really cool about Independence, Missouri, it's like the site of 3 trail starts. So the Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, I'm not sure if it was Lewis and Clark or a different one, but maybe the California, but all three of the trails set off from the same point. And there's a reason for that. It's because Independence, Missouri had the best place to kind of get all the goods you needed and get the wagon axles you needed, and all those supplies were ready and waiting for you. Then you could strike out and make your travels west.
All right. Now, William has another question. How much research did you do before the trip versus how much did you learn along the way?
Oh, gosh, William. Awesome.
Probably hard to quantify, right?
I wish I could say like 40, 60 or something, but I guess what I'll say is I read everything I had time to read between December when I first had the idea and June 8th when we left. And so a lot of that was trail journals, secondary books. There's one called The Oregon Trail by a guy named Rinker Buck, who in around 2008 or so retraced the trail with his brother with literal mule-drawn wagons. This guy did it with a mule-drawn wagon. So while we were in our rental Jeep Compass, they did it with a couple of mules. So props to them. So there's a lot of kind of information from Francis Parkman's original trail journals in the 1850s or so to more recent books. So we did a lot of that, watched all the documentaries, watched some Ken Burns, The West, all of that business. But I think the most lasting lessons came from being there. What the most fun for me was to look at like historical photos of, say, there's these major sites, Scotts Bluff, Independence Rock, Chimney Rock, and then to actually go there and like hold up the picture and see how little it had changed. I mean, Chimney Rock's changed maybe 2 feet, 3 feet, shrunk a little bit over the years. And it's just incredible how so much has changed over that time in terms of culture and who we are as Americans. And yet the geology is right where we left it for the most part.
But at the same time, like when you got to Portland, it was a bit of a shock in a different direction, right?
Yeah, it was weird to kind of go back to cities, and especially big cities. Certainly Portland was rather small in those Oregon Trail days as well. But we did have a kind of a re-entry struggle, or at least I did. I didn't know what to do with myself. We were in Portland for maybe 24 hours, and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. It had nothing to do with Portland, but I'd come to appreciate like the power of the ritual of setting up the tent, putting up our little hammock in the tree, getting the fire going. And what was so cool about this was like at the beginning of this trip, Henry couldn't even put together the tent pole, and by the end of it, I'd be like, Henry, get the tent up. I'll be right back. And he just did it. And it was so cool to see that much growth in a 6-year-old over 2 weeks. He went from not terribly self-sufficient to a lot more self-sufficient. He became a huge help by the end of the trip. A lot more. Yeah.
What was that, Henry?
Don't believe it.
Don't believe it. I believe it. It's true. He did.
I'm not self-sufficient.
All right. Now, Henry, A, were you this sassy when you were on the trip?
Not really.
No.
He is.
This trip happened how long ago?
40% of my life ago.
Yeah.
40% of your life ago. So he is not only a math major, he's 10 years old now and was 6 when he went on this trip.
Yeah.
And William asked another question regarding the duration of the trip. So the trip was 2 weeks.
Yep. And
it was not a round trip car trip.
Correct. Nope. We spent those 2 weeks kind of pushing west, every KOA, every fort, every museum we could get. And then we ended up just taking a plane home. It was a rental car. My wife needed us to get our butts back home and help with the other kid. So we had to call it quits. And I have a photo of Henry peering out the window and just being so happy with all the movie options on the plane. It had been a long time since we saw a screen. So it was a award at the end of the journey, just like the real immigration.
Christopher Robin, I thought this came out. I thought this is coming out in June. Yep. Oh no, this is a documentary. This sucks. Okay. How do I get out?
All right. He was pretty pleased with all the choices, I assure you. But.
Gotcha. Oh, I just wanted to mention, by the way, because this kind of you mentioned Rinker Buck. He has a new book coming out called Life on the Mississippi. And if you know your Mark Twain, he wrote Life on the Mississippi.
Oh,
and
cool.
Rinker takes a log raft down the Mississippi. And he was a former reporter for the Hartford Courant. So we are looking forward to hopefully having him come to the Twain House and talk about his book. Henry.
Yes.
Wait, so he survived that raft?
I think so, because he wrote a book about it.
That's impressive. Yeah. Well played, Rinker. Well played. He's always one step ahead of me. I love it.
All right. We have 2 votes for a question. I'm going to throw this one to Henry instead of to BJ, because we're a little tired of hearing you talk. Henry. What dangers or risks did you encounter on this trip?
2 words. Rattlesnakes.
Is that one word or two?
I think it's one word.
One word.
Right. So did you see them in person? Or you just heard them?
One. We saw one. There was most of the time we just heard them, but there was this one time when we were at Scotts Bluff and we were walking and I just looked.
That may have occurred. We definitely heard a lot. I think we saw something slither away. Not sure it was a rattler, but in my head, everything was a rattler. I remember every time we talked to someone, I'd be like, "So, how concerned should we be about rattlesnakes?" And truly, it wasn't. That wasn't a huge threat. I think some of the other threats we have were just the storm and camping in inclement weather and getting really, really lost sometimes, and being in trucks with people we didn't even know and hitchhiking, these sorts of things. But in the end, it all worked out. So
don't talk to strangers. Free candy.
Okay, we talked to strangers.
Although you did take $5 from a stranger.
That's different.
That's different because they couldn't have put a tracker on it or something.
Yeah. There was no tracker on the $5.
So.
Okay, I just thought cash makes the difference.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
you can get a lot more candy for $5. All right, Michael has a few questions in here. So one of Michael's questions is, did you visit any national or state parks? And what do you think of the landscape changes in sunrises and sunsets?
Oh, these are great. I'm trying to think if we had any state parks in there. We were signed up for a state park or two, and then we had to ditch those plans. No national parks.
Are there any national parks along the route, or you're kind of?
I mean, I'm
sort of south of Yellowstone.
Yeah, exactly. We were always 3 hours away. I remember seeing Rocky Mountain Park. It was just a little farther than we could have managed. I remember looking at my phone thinking, did we dare? We did not dare. But the sunset question and the sunrise question is a really interesting one too. And maybe it's just because the skies, it's big sky country, and so where we live here in Wisconsin, it's a sunrise and a sunset means one thing, and perhaps in Connecticut as well. But Douglas, Wyoming, I have a picture of this most expansive sky and a sun that stretched forever. And it was truly not a religious experience, but it was just, I had never seen the sun look that big for so long. And I have a couple of photos about it, of it, because it was shocking to me how different it looked. It kind of felt like it wasn't on planet Earth anymore. So maybe, I'm not sure if that's a West thing or just happened to be a particularly interesting sunny day, but you're right. I think there is something different about it. And maybe it's a sky thing. Maybe it's just fewer buildings, fewer structures, but there's something to be said there. Good question.
And I think it may have been a different Michael. Michael Fisher asked, what about that oil change?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I saw that one.
So the short answer, a guy named Dave from Jiffy Lube hooked us up very generously. The funny part about Dave was he was so gruff. At the start, he wanted nothing to do with us. He heard it was a rental car. He's like, I'm not touching a rental car. You're never gonna get reimbursed. And then I explained the whole trip thing. And that's where he kind of softened. That's when he kind of, said he'd help us out. He did whatever he did, threw the keys back, didn't want our money, send me a postcard. And I kept in touch with him. I called him up when the book first came out. And I was like, hey, Dave, you don't remember me, but, help us with an oil change. He's like, of course I remember you. He was equally gruff. And I was like, well, hey, we'd love to get a copy of the book. He's like, I'll take one and I'll order 8 more. Click. And so he's a big fan. God bless Dave. He is. But it was just so cool. I mean, one of those, again, just rare encounters where we really needed someone to come through for us. And he sure did.
And I'm going to do one last question from William and then a question from me. And William, you have been the question asking all-star here. How did you know what routes to follow? Did AAA map it out for you in advance? Just kidding.
They did not. There's a trail guide by a woman named Julie Fancelo. I got it back there on the shelf somewhere. She actually did the trip more of as a trail, as a travel guide writer, but her daughter happened with her during the trip. And so that book was maybe published in 1991 or so, but it was really helpful to kind of mark things through. And there were a couple moments in that book where she mentioned, just casually, if you have a kid, this is a great stop for you. So I ended up calling her up on the phone and we had a really good talk, mostly about rattlesnakes. But beyond that, stops that we had to do, we had to see. And so that was a huge resource, but also I joined the Oregon-California Trail Association. And this is chapter by chapter of groups of people all across the route who kind of are this network of people who are helpful. And so they really helped us plot our journey too.
Is there money to be in there?
Yeah, you join a fee. You join for a fee.
So Henry, worst meal on the trip?
I know this. I hate this. But Denny's.
Denny's.
We went to Denny's 2 times. because we had this hotel, and literally it's like hotel, Denny's, and so Denny's was right next door. Dad had us go 2 nights in a row. The first night I was like, hey dad, can we go to Denny's? And then he was like, sure. Second night I was like, hey dad, can we go to Denny's? Because the first night I was like, this is good. But then the second night after it was done, I was like, never again.
Well, kids eat free on Tuesdays, so that was most of the motivation there.
And then the next year we went as a family, and they're like, Henry, happy half birthday. We're gonna go take you somewhere. So they're like, close your eyes. We're there. Denny's.
And that concludes all of our trips to Denny's ever. Thank you.
All right. Best meal on the trip. Because there's some good meals, and I have a question about a drawing. But what was the best meal?
Best meal.
The one at the cowboy place.
Oh, and Ogallala buffalo burgers. We had some solid buffalo burgers, and we just had like 8 glasses of water. It was so hot. That was a good one, right?
Home of the side salad, though.
Remember the side salad?
Now, what is this donut tower?
That's Voodoo Donuts.
Voodoo Donuts. And that was a great stop?
It was pretty good. Just stay clear of the people in Godzilla costumes. They can freak you out real bad.
Portland is weird. I think that's their phrase, and that was certainly our experience. But we had to get the donuts because in a lot of the original immigrant trail journals, there are always references to Voodoo Donuts, and so we really wanted to stay historically accurate.
All right. Well, folks, as you can see, they pack a lot into relatively few pages, but I can't recommend Go West. Thank you, young man, enough. Do you have a review for us? Henry, what do you think of this book?
How many stars?
1.
1 star.
Okay, 5 stars.
It's out of 5 stars. So
5 stars, but 4 of those stars are for the illustrations. And the stars is for Dad's writing. So please click on that link. And again, your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum and Henry's college fund. And all right, Henry, do you have any parting thoughts for the audience? Well,
if there's any kids out there, you need to make sure your parents do not get any ideas from this. And if so, run away at all costs.
Okay. Thank you, Henry. And Henry did sign those book plates, so the autographs will come from us both, just so you know.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you both so much for joining us tonight. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And thank you, as always, for your support of the Mark Twain House and Museum. Bye.
Thanks, Jacques.